One of the interesting things about those of us who live and grew up in the West is that we find it very difficult to imagine ourselves as being the bad guys. It's always interpreted through a lens of good versus evil, and naturally we're good, and therefore those that we are up against must, by the very nature of that dialectic, be evil. And what's interesting about the Muslim tradition is that good and evil, to put it in Shakespeare's terms, that we're of a mingled yarn, good and ill woven together, that human beings have between their two sides this dialectic going on. And so when you live in a Manichaean worldview, which is where good and evil are externalized, they're purely objective realities, then you lose that sense of nuance. No country is purely good, and no country is purely evil. It's a continuum of good and evil. Some are more good than they are evil, and some are more evil than they are good. But even the most evil governments have some good in them. And even the most virtuous governments have evil in them. It's just simply the nature of life on earth. Every human being has this admixture. The Prophet ﷺ himself said, everybody has a shaitan. Only his shaitan entered into submission. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But it's not like there wasn't one there. It's just that one happened to become Muslim because his assignment was the most persuasive human being that ever lived, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the most rightly guided. And so the idea somehow that this government is, the idea somehow that this government is bad or needs to be removed. Some people consider that necessary, obviously enough to attempt to remove it. But this is a democratic or Republican government. However, a proper usage of the term would be a republic. True democracies don't exist on this planet. We use that word very loosely. But a true democracy would be where everybody had the right to vote, maybe through the internet, for all the decisions. Because democratic Greek democracy, all the free males had to vote. It was actually considered a civic duty. But now we elect officials and they run the governments. Most people are what they now call low-informed voters. They really don't know very much that's happening or going on. Most Americans have no idea what their government's doing in other places in the world and believe the type of cartoon worldviews that are provided for them, these black and white scenarios of good and evil. So we were praying that all of us, all over the world, we're praying just because we don't want to see a country that has so much goodness, so many blessings, and of an ummah that's going through one of the most difficult times in our history, undeniably. We've had very difficult times. The Muslim ummah has had incredibly difficult times in the past, and then we've had periods of great triumph. But one of the fantasies of Muslims is that Muslim history is a history of these great empires. The real Muslim history is a history of individuals, because civilizations are made up of people. They're aggregates of people. And if you really did a true history of the Muslim world, you'd have to be able to look into the houses of the peoples that were living in those places and how they were living and what they were doing and what they were preoccupying their lives with and their time with. And it would be very different from the sweeping histories that historians write, which are usually about empires and governments and people of power. They never really write about the simple people. If you want to see glimpses of true history, then the best thing to do is read the tabaqat literature of the notables of any given time period. Ibn Sa'din, the great historian, wrote the tabaqat of the early period of Islam. And that's where you're going to really find out the real history. If you want to read the real history of Medina, we're very fortunate in that the Prophet ﷺ is the single most historically documented human being that ever lived. Nobody knows more about a historical figure than our ummah does about our Prophet ﷺ. No other community has that. We know how he washed himself. We know how he ate. We know what he ate. We know how he dressed. We know how he got up. We know how he went to sleep. We know how he interacted with people, how he greeted people. We know his proclivities in literature. We know what poets he liked. We know what poets he didn't like. We know the name of his donkey and his mule. We know his love of cats. We know the types of cloth that he wore. We actually know the colors and the patterns of his cloth. We know the pattern of his sandals. We know exactly what his sandals look like. I don't know the pattern or the sandals of George Washington, or maybe they have his shoes at Mount Vernon, I don't know, but I don't even know what Hillary Clinton's shoes look like. And I could care less, but I'm interested in what the Prophet ﷺ's shoes look like. So that's the reality of our Prophet ﷺ. Turkey has been through a lot of difficult times. This is one of the most traumatized countries. In 1924, I mean, imagine if today Obama or Theresa May or Holland and France announced that, given the fact that the Chinese are rising in power, we've decided now to transliterate all of our language into Chinese ideograms in order to facilitate our people learning Chinese. And then overnight, you had a nation of, maybe in America, I'm being very generous, 90% literacy, and suddenly they're 100% illiteracy overnight. It's amazing. That's a trauma. That's trauma. Imagine people that wore traditional hats, and then those hats were made illegal. Turbans were made illegal. And they had to wear rimmed hats, which some of the ulama considered kufr at the time, that if you adopted a rim hat, that you weren't a Muslim. There's actually fatwas, which is extreme, but nonetheless, the point was they were really trying to prevent imitation of non-Muslim cultures. And then I was reading the Herald Tribune many years ago, and they have this thing 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And in one of those it said 17 Naqshbandi sheikhs were hung in Turkey today. Just like that, because they wanted to eliminate the zawiyas or the khanaqas. They wanted to eliminate anything that they considered superstitious. Religion was superstitious, and especially Sufism. So it had that trauma, and then it had the trauma of just a radical type of secularism that is akin, even more extreme than the secularism of France, which they call laicism, which the secularism, for those of us that are from the US or from Canada or England, we have a secularism that acknowledges a place for religion, although it's increasingly marginalizing religion and becoming more laicist in its attitudes towards religion. Nonetheless, you can still be a religious person in a public office and display your religiosity, and even say that your religiosity informs your decisions. So I'm pro-life because I'm a Catholic. A politician can say that, and it would be perfectly acceptable. Whereas in France, that is not the case. And in Turkey, that was the case until very recently. So this idea somehow that Islamists have taken over Turkey is ridiculous. These are not Islamists. They're Muslims who want to see a secular state that is not laicist, but allows for devotional practice, not just of the population, but also in the public space, so that a woman can be a member of parliament and wear the hijab if she so fits. Nobody is calling for the implementation of hudud punishments. Nobody's calling for the persecution of heretics or sects. There's 12 million Alawis in Turkey. Nobody's calling for the removal or the forced conversion of those people. And so the argument is, well, they're not calling for it yet, but this is a slippery slope. Well, the slippery slope arguments, these are logical fallacies, because you can make that about anything. There's no evidence that we have. And the idea that people would get angry that people break their fast publicly in Ramadan, that are Turkish and Muslim, that's understandable just for any people that take religion seriously and see religion being publicly neglected. But that's actually not from the Sunnah, because the Sunnah is to think, oh, that person must be sick, or they don't assume that they're simply breaking it. But the decorum of Muslim culture traditionally was, if you were breaking your fast, you did not do so in public, just as a type of courtesy to the other members of society. And this is where the pre-modern and the modern world are very different, because the pre-modern world has a more collectivist attitude. It sees community as more important than the individual. Modern society has reversed that. The individual is paramount, and the community has to suffer the appetites and the personal tastes of the individual, so that if you come to Turkey, you can wear shorts, even though traditionally that would have been seen as a complete breach of social decorum. But today, that's an individual's right to do what they want, and you have no right to tell me otherwise. The same now we have to suffer in the 1960s and 70s, when the feminists started arguing that women were being objectified and that it wasn't right that they should be objectified. Advertisers, instead of saying, that's a good point, let's stop objectifying sexually women, they said, you're right, it's unfair. So now we have to suffer naked men as well as naked women on the billboards. So it's equal opportunity exploitation. So this is a reality, and Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya argues that this is a reality of our time. The zeitgeist of our time is individuality, and we have to take that into consideration, that the individual now has a type of authority that they never had in the past. And we need, unfortunately, to recognize that, especially in societies where that is still a very strong aspect of that society. In certain other societies where the collectivist tendencies are still strong, like in the Gulf states, but it's breaking down clearly. I mean, anybody that has watched Arab television of late will be amazed to see the complete, utter mock imitation of Western society amongst the youth today. So all the Saudi kids have their baseball caps on the side, and they've all got their hairstyles that the Prophet ﷺ did not like and told people not to do it, where you shave part of the head and leave part of it long. This is just the reality of it. So we have a hegemonic civilization that promotes itself, on the one hand, persuasively through mass media, through films. So all these kids that have grown up on American films, we find all these young Egyptians now that speak fluent English, and you ask them, did you live in the West? No. Well, how'd you learn to speak such good English? Watching American movies. And I've seen so many young people like that in the Arab world that are like that now. So those movies have more than just entertainment. They have embedded messages. I mean, I'll give you a common trope in films. You know, two police come to a place, and the bad guys are possibly inside, and they're going to break it down. And one of the cops says, we don't have a warrant. And the other cop says, the hell with warrants. And then the other one says, yeah, and boom, they just bust in. Right? So that's a message that due process of law is not necessary when the greater good, which is to capture the bad guys, is the goal. Well, that's a very dangerous concept in a society where you want the rule of law to exist, because our tradition says it's better that 1,000 guilty go free than one innocent person. That's Abu Hanifa. That's the Islamic tradition. It's better 1,000 guilty people go free than that one innocent person is unjustly imprisoned or executed. So there are messages in all those films. One of the messages is loose sexuality. Marriage is rarely discussed in modern films. People meet and mate like animals, and even some animals mate for life. Like wolves, right? So you don't just get the entertainment, you get messages, and those messages have effects on people whether they like it or not. You've seen enough commercials to you should have realized why you're buying that brand of toothpaste instead of some other brand. Right? Because you've been programmed to buy certain things. One of the things about pre-modern people is that they all dress the same. One of the things you'll note about billionaires like Steve Jobs, the most creative people on the planet, people like Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs, they wear the same clothes every single day. Steve Jobs never wore anything other than that t-shirt and his jeans. Why? Because they're thinking about bigger things than their wardrobe. And so that was one of the hallmarks of Muslim society, is that the purpose of dress is to veil your modesty. And then Muslims embellished things because they were people of beauty, and so they tended to adorn their clothes, but they did not, Muslims had nothing to do with this idea of fashion or style. Every year there's a new, you can't wear these because they're out of fashion, things like that. Muslims would have never thought of something like that. But they did take urf very seriously, and in fact, in Adab ad-Din wa Dunya by Imam al-Mawardi, the great Shafi'i scholar and political scientist, he has a section on the adab of clothes and talks about the fact that the sunnah is to wear the clothes of the place that you're in. And he said it's stupidity and foolishness not to. He said you should not draw attention to yourself. And he actually interpreted, and other scholars have interpreted, the hadith about man labisa libas al-shuhra albasu Allahu libas al-dhulli yawm al-qiyamah. That if you wear clothes that call attention to yourself, Allah will clothe you in humiliation on the Day of Judgment. And they interpreted that to mean actually to wear clothes where people looked and pointed at you. And the Prophet said that it's not a good thing to have people pointing fingers at you. So, in any case, we're happy that the coup was unsuccessful. I was asked to talk over the telephone to Kunya. They had a big rally there. And I just said to him that democracy is majority rule. There's always going to be disgruntled people. If you were in England, maybe you didn't want Brexit, but the majority voted it in, and so you have to suffer the tyranny of the majority, because that's what a democracy is. It's tyranny of a majority. And so the way to deal with that is to wait for the election cycle to run itself out, and then you try to get your person elected or your party elected. That's the way it works. But nobody's going to be happy all the time. It's just not going to happen in dunya. So we're happy that they succeeded in keeping their government. But these are fragile things. Governments are fragile things. Syrians know that, Iraqis know that, Libyans know that, Yemenis know that, Chechens know that, the Lebanese who remember the civil war that lasted over 10 years know that things break down. And they're horrible when they break down. And so you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy a collapse of a government, because it's really a horrible thing. And military governments, military dictatorships are horrible. The definition of hurriya in Islamic law is freedom of movement. That's literally the definition of hurriya. That as long as a government provides the ability for you to freely move in a society, it's considered a free society. That when it curtails your movements, either through curfews, house arrest, or limiting places that you can go to, it's no longer a free society. So freedom of movement is a great gift, just to be able to go where you want to, when you want to, and not be told you have to stay here or stay there. And historically, immigration was a human right. Like the Quran clearly makes immigration a human right. National boundaries are a modern invention. Historically, people were moved around, and the world is filled with migrations. And nobody has a right to claim really any country as their own. The Hijaz is filled with people from all over the Muslim world. Why? Why are there so many Indians in Mecca now? There's all these Central Asians. And they're citizens of the country now, but where did they come from? They came from Hajj, and they stayed. Because that was a human right. Before 1914 in the United States of America, anybody that showed up in the United States got in. You didn't have to have a passport, travel documents. You just got on a boat. If you had enough cash, they did refuse some people entry that had for epidemiological concerns. If they had tuberculosis, things like that. They'd actually have health inspectors, and they would inspect them, and if they thought they had a disease that could spread amongst the population, then they considered it a public health issue, and they did not let them in, or they quarantined them. But people just came in, and that's why there's so many immigrants in America. And this is the irony of anti-immigrant movements. Anyway.